Think about what that means. The best scientific minds in the country, people who dedicate their entire lives to finding rational explanations, spent years on that land and walked away with their hands up. That's not a failure of science. That's something far more disturbing. That's science looking into the dark and blinking first. Because whatever lives in that desert, it doesn't play by our rules. It shifts. It hides. It watches. And when it decides to show itself, it picks the form most likely to break you. Not kill you. Break you. There's a difference. And that difference is what makes Skinwalker Ranch not just a mystery.
Before we dive into today's investigation, I want to be clear. The stories and theories shared on this channel are part of an alternative history exploration. We're digging into the unexplained, the unsettling, and the what-ifs of our world. Think of this as a journey into the dark side of history, part research, part legend. Watch with an open mind, but remember, this is for narrative and entertainment purposes only.
They found things out there that have no business existing. That's not a theory. That's what the scientists wrote in their official reports. Scientists with PhDs, with decades of fieldwork, with zero tolerance for nonsense. And after years of living on that land, after watching things crawl out of the sky and make their cattle disappear without a trace, they still couldn't explain it. Not one word of it. This is Skinwalker Ranch. 500 acres of high desert in northeastern Utah. And the year is 1994. The tape is grainy. The timestamp flickers. But what got recorded out there in that dust and silence? That stuff doesn't go away just because you hit stop. Here's the thing about this place that messes with your head right from the jump. It's not just some campfire ghost story passed around by locals. This ranch became the center of a serious, funded, decade-long scientific investigation. We're talking about real researchers, real equipment, real money, and at the end of it all, they still couldn't tell you what was out there. Think about what that means. The best scientific minds in the country, people who dedicate their entire lives to finding rational explanations, spent years on that land and walked away with their hands up. That's not a failure of science. That's something far more disturbing. That's science looking into the dark and blinking first. Because whatever lives in that desert, it doesn't play by our rules. It shifts. It hides. It watches. And when it decides to show itself, it picks the form most likely to break you. Not kill you. Break you. There's a difference. And that difference is what makes Skinwalker Ranch not just a mystery. It's a psychological horror story dressed up in desert dust and dead cattle. You think you'd be skeptical if you drove out there. You think you'd last a week and laugh it off. That's exactly what the PhDs thought too. Before one single weird thing happened on that ranch, the land itself was already bleeding. And I don't mean that poetically. I mean there is a wound in that geography that goes back over 150 years. Cut open by slavery, sealed shut by a curse, and never healed. In the 1800s, the Ute and Navajo tribes were at war. And not just a territorial dispute. The Utes captured Navajo people and sold them to American settlers as slaves. That is the soil this ranch sits on. That is the history you're walking through every time you step onto that property. The Navajo didn't forget. They couldn't. And out of that kind of generational pain, the kind that doesn't have words for it, only rituals, they cursed the land. The Skinwalker, a shape-wearing witch, predatory spirit, something that wears the skin of animals and people to hunt, to torment, to destroy. The Navajo placed it there as a weapon of vengeance against the Utes who had stolen their people. Now let that sink in for a second. This wasn't some vague bad energy. This was a deliberate supernatural landmine planted in the earth with intent, with rage, with the full weight of a people who had nothing left but their spiritual power. And then, over a century later, a regular American family pulls up in a moving truck. They signed a deed. They paid below market price because nobody wanted the place. They had no idea they were parking their dreams right on top of a geographical scar that was designed to harbor monsters. The cruelest part of this whole story starts right here. Not with a UFO, not with a creature. It starts with a family that had no idea what kind of ground they were standing on. And that ground had been waiting. Terry and Gwen Sherman thought they were getting a steal. And they were. Just not in the way they imagined when they signed the papers. The price was low. Way too low. The kind of low that, in hindsight, screams at you. But they were excited. They had kids. They had cattle. They had a dream of wide open space and clean desert air. So they pulled up to the homestead in 1994 with hope written all over their faces. And then they looked at the house. Every single window had deadbolts. Not just one lock, deadbolts. On windows. And every interior door had locks on both sides. Inside, you'd lock yourself into a room and you'd need a key to get back out. Who does that? Who builds a prison inside their own home and calls it a house? And out in the yard, massive iron pikes driven deep into the earth. Heavy chains looped through them. The kind of setup you'd use if you were expecting something enormous to come at you from the outside. Something you genuinely believed couldn't be stopped any other way. Here's the psychological gut punch of this moment. The previous owners didn't leave a note. They didn't explain any of it. They just built their cage and they left. And when Terry and Gwen looked past the quirky details, past the overgrown grass and the worn-out wood, they didn't see a warning. They saw a fixer-upper. That's the thing about dread. It disguises itself as inconvenience, until you're already inside and the door is locked on both sides. The family moved in. They started unpacking. And something out in that desert exhaled. Slow, patient, satisfied, because the new occupants had just walked straight into a trap that someone else had already built for them. They didn't wait long. Day one. Moving boxes still on the truck. And there it was. Terry was out by the fence line on their very first day when he spotted a shape at the tree line. Big. Moving slow. He didn't panic right away. Out here in cattle country, you see large animals. Dogs, strays, the occasional coyote. You get used to sizing things up from a distance. So he watched it come. And the first thing that hit him wasn't fear. It was calm. An eerie, bone-deep calm that settled over the whole family as this creature approached. His wife felt it. His kids felt it. That weird, artificial peace, like something was turning down the volume on your survival instincts. The animal came right up to them, wagging its tail, letting Terry's father reach out and rub its head. Huge, docile, almost hypnotically friendly. But then Terry lined it up against a 6-foot fence post. And the math stopped working. This wolf, because that's what it looked like, a wolf, was 6 feet long, nose to tail, standing upright at the shoulder like a small pony. Not a large dog, not an oversized coyote. 6 feet. Of something that should not be that big and should definitely not be that calm walking up to strangers on day one. That false peace? That eerie calm that washed over the family? That's the psychological trick. That's the entity running its first test. Can I get close? Can I make them trust me? Can I get them to let their guard drop completely? Because what happened next didn't come from nowhere. It came from a predator who had already mapped every person on that property. The calm was the setup. What came next was the snap. It happened in a split second. That's the part nobody talks about enough. 1 second it's a calm, tail-wagging animal. And then it just snaps, like flipping a switch. The creature lunged at one of the calves through the bullpen bars, clamping its jaws around the calf's head with a force that rattled the whole structure. The trance shattered instantly. Terry went from charmed bystander to desperate fighter in 0 seconds flat, which is exactly what this thing wanted to see. How does a human respond when the illusion drops? He grabbed an axe. He beat the thing. He fired his rifle at it. Point blank. Shots that connected, he saw them hit, and this 6-foot wolf didn't even flinch, didn't yelp, didn't stagger. It absorbed the bullets like they were nothing and kept its grip on that calf until it got bored. Then it just walked away, trotted even, unbothered, calm again, like a predator that had already decided this interaction was over. And it left behind a smell. That's the detail that keeps showing up in every account of this thing. A thick, chemical metallic stench, like burnt copper mixed with something rotten. It clung to the air long after the creature disappeared back into the tree line. Psychologically, this is the moment where the family's reality broke. Not the deadbolts, not the cheap price, this moment, because there is a specific kind of terror that comes from watching bullets hit something and do absolutely nothing. It tells your brain in one brutal instant that every rule you understood about the physical world is wrong. Your weapons don't work. Your logic doesn't apply. You are in something's territory now, and it already knows that. You don't sleep the same after a moment like that. Not ever. After a thing survives your bullets and trots away, the rational mind does something interesting. It doubles down. Says, no, that can't be right, let's go look for tracks, let's find evidence. Let's prove there's a normal explanation here. So Terry grabbed his son. They went into the dark tree line after it. Armed, determined, following the paw prints through the mud like investigators at a crime scene. And the tracks were there. Deep, clear, unmistakable impressions in the waterlogged earth. They followed them step by step into a muddy clearing, the ground soft enough to hold every mark perfectly. And then the tracks just stopped, mid-stride, in the middle of an open, muddy clearing with nowhere to hide. No jump to drier ground, no rock to step onto, no logical explanation. The prints led in and then they ended right there in the center of the clearing. Like the animal had simply ceased to exist in that spot. No blood from the bullet wounds. No disturbed brush. No sound. Just silence and that faint ghost of chemical metallic odor. Here's the thing that messes with you when you think about it. The mud was the trap, but not for the creature. The mud was for Terry. Because finding those tracks and following them was supposed to lead to a discovery, to evidence, to proof. Instead, it led him to the single most destabilizing realization a human can have. That the laws of physics don't apply to what he's dealing with. You can track an animal. You can hunt something with mass, with weight, with biology. But you cannot track something that can disappear mid-step. That night, Terry didn't just lose the creature. He lost his grip on how the world works. And that's a much harder thing to get back. While Terry was out fighting wolves that absorbed bullets, Gwen was inside the house fighting something quieter. Something that targeted her mind specifically. Started small. The way these things always do. Groceries she'd just put away on the kitchen shelves were back in their paper bags on the counter. Every item, repacked, like they'd never been touched. She checked herself. Did I actually put those away? She went back over the sequence in her head. Yes, she had. She was certain. Then her shower towel disappeared. She just used it. She checked the bathroom floor, the hamper, the hook on the door. Gone. Found it an hour later, neatly folded and hanging in a closet on the completely opposite side of the house. And she told no one. That's the psychological genius of what this entity was doing. It wasn't going big. It wasn't showing her a monster at the window. It was dismantling her confidence in her own perception. Quietly, privately, hitting her with the kind of events that sound completely insane when said out loud. The kind that make you think, I must be losing my mind. She genuinely considered she was having a stroke. A neurological event. Some kind of breakdown triggered by the stress of the move. Because that explanation, as terrifying as it is, felt more credible than the alternative. That isolation, that silent suffering, that desperate internal debate between what you experienced and what you're willing to admit, that's the cruelest kind of psychological warfare. It requires no physical presence at all. Just a towel in the wrong closet and a family's groceries rearranged. The damage it does to a person's sense of reality is permanent. Gwen never fully recovered from that desert. Whatever was living on that property didn't only want to terrify. It wanted to communicate, and when it finally sent its clearest message, Terry almost missed it because it was hanging 70 feet in the air. He'd been working the fence line under the brutal Utah sun. Grinding, sweaty ranch work, the kind that keeps your head down and your mind on the physical task in front of you. He was using a massive iron tool, 70 pounds of it, designed for driving fence posts into hard ground. Industrial strength, the kind of thing you don't misplace. He set it down, walked away for a few minutes, came back, gone. Not dropped in the grass, not kicked aside, gone. 70 pounds of iron, vanished from a flat, open stretch of dirt. He searched the area. Nothing. Days passed. Terry kept working the ranch, kept checking, kept running through every rational explanation he could invent. Theft? Who steals a fence tool from a working ranch? Misplaced? You don't misplace 70 pounds. Then one morning, a week later, he looked up. There it was, balanced at the very top of a massive tree, 70 feet off the ground. Not wedged in the branches, placed there, deliberately, like a trophy, like a message hung somewhere you'd have to crane your neck to see. The physics of getting that tool up there don't work for any human being. Not alone, not with equipment, not without leaving tracks or signs. This was a demonstration of power, cold, taunting, precise. And for the first time, Terry and Gwen sat down together and compared notes. Every terrifying thing each of them had been silently carrying. Every incident they'd hidden from each other to avoid sounding crazy. They finally admitted it out loud. Something with impossible strength was playing with them. And it had been doing it since day one. Terry was not a man who scared easy. You need to understand that about him. He was a working rancher. Physical, practical, the kind of guy who beats a monster wolf with an axe and then goes looking for the tracks afterward. He didn't rattle. So when he saw lights at the edge of his property in the middle of the night, he didn't hide. He grabbed his flashlight and walked straight toward them. From a distance, they looked like truck headlights sitting low at the fence line. His first thought was poachers. Somebody trespassing on his land. Running lights they shouldn't be running at this hour. He dealt with trespassers before. He knew how to handle people. He moved faster, getting within shouting distance. The lights were there, clear and bright, hovering at the edge of the property. And then he noticed there was no sound, no engine, no idle, no crunch of tires. Complete, dead silence coming from a pair of what looked like headlights floating in the dark. Not parked, hovering, low to the ground but not touching it. He kept walking toward them and they kept retreating at exactly his pace, keeping the same distance. Not fleeing in panic, not gunning it to escape. Just maintaining that precise gap like something running a test to see how close he'd actually come. Then the lights tilted upward, smooth, fluid, mechanical, and floated straight up into the sky until they disappeared. He stood in the dark for a long time after that, because he'd come out here to deal with a person, a flesh and blood human trespasser he could argue with or chase off. What he got instead was a reminder that whatever was on his land wasn't human. And it had just proved it while watching him the whole time. Winter came to Skinwalker Ranch the way it always does out there. Suddenly, completely, turning everything into a white field that reveals what moves through it. In that sense, the snow should have been Terry's advantage. Evidence. Tracks proof. It wasn't. A stray cow went missing somewhere in the frozen property. Terry and his son tracked it the way you track any missing animal in winter, following the clear, crisp hoof prints through the white. The snow held every impression perfectly. The trail was easy to follow. It led directly into the same tree line, the same patch of woods where the wolf had disappeared, the same stretch of forest that already had a history of swallowing things whole. And the tracks stopped. Same exact spot. Same mid-stride disappearance in the middle of ground that should have held every impression for days. There was no blood, no sign of struggle, no spray of snow to indicate the animal had jumped or bolted sideways. Just a trail that walked into a specific stretch of earth and ceased to exist. Over that winter, 5 cattle vanished this way. 5 animals worth serious money to a working rancher. Each time, the tracks. Each time, the same ending. The same silence. The same specific geography swallowing them whole like a drain. This is the moment the ranch stopped being a weird experience and started being a financial catastrophe. Because ghosts and entities and floating lights, you can hold those at arm's length in your mind, file them under unexplained, keep going. But losing 5 cattle? That's your livelihood. That's your family's future. That's real, physical, economic damage being done by something you can't touch, can't track, and can't stop. The desert wasn't just haunted. It was predatory. By this point, Terry had stopped being a rancher who was confused and had become a man at war. He just didn't fully know it yet. He was out in the freezing brush late one night, weapon in hand, crouched and motionless. Not sleeping, not hiding, watching. He turned the ranch into a stakeout, using the same patience and stillness that makes a good cattle tracker and pointing it at whatever kept taking his animals. That's when he saw it. Approximately 20 feet off the ground. Silent, hovering. A shape that didn't match anything in any aircraft manual. A small dark mass shaped like a stealth fighter but scaled down, and moving with the kind of smooth, deliberate motion that all the machines on Earth right now cannot replicate. Underneath it, multicolored lights swept slowly across the frozen ground, scanning, methodical, like it was searching for something specific in the dark. Terry held absolutely still. His breath slowed. He was good at this. A lifetime of hunting had taught him how to become invisible in a field. And then he made a tiny sound. A twig, a branch, the smallest possible noise against the winter silence. The craft's lights snapped off instantly. Every single one. Complete darkness. And then it rotated, slowly, in the exact direction he was hiding. No sound. No visible sensor. Nothing that should have been able to locate him in the dark. But it rotated and it pointed itself directly at his position with a precision that told him clearly. I heard you. I know exactly where you are. I'm looking right at you. That feeling of being found by something that shouldn't be able to find you doesn't leave. It rewires something in your brain about what it means to be the observer instead of the observed. Spring 1995. The snow melted, and the missing cattle started coming back. Not alive, dead, but not the way a predator kills. Not torn apart, not scattered, not dragged. What Terry found when his missing animals reappeared was something that pulled the bottom out of his stomach and sent him calling veterinarians and law enforcement who had no framework to respond. The cuts were surgical. That's the word every single expert used when they examined the carcasses. Surgical, bloodless, specific organs removed with a precision that matched operating room technique. Not claw marks, not bite wounds, no tearing, no bruising. Clean edges on clean cuts. Tissue removed that required anatomical knowledge to even locate. No blood at the site, not a drop. From animals that should have contained gallons of it. No tracks approaching the body. No tracks leaving it. Whatever was doing this wasn't hungry. This wasn't predation for food. This was collection. Sampling. This was something running experiments on Terry's livestock the way a researcher runs tests on lab specimens. Methodically, consistently, with obvious technical capability. The Pennywise parallel hits hardest right here. Because the Pennywise entity in Stephen King's story doesn't just kill, performs, terrorizes intentionally. It feeds on the fear as much as on the flesh. And whatever was working on these cattle wasn't just removing organs. It was making sure Terry found them, making sure he understood the message. You are in my laboratory. These are my specimens. And you, standing there with your rifle and your boots and your working man's courage, are the next animal I'm studying. He didn't know yet how right that was. They came at night, tall, featureless, black, not shadow tall, actually tall, humanoid in shape but stretched out in proportion in a way that doesn't map to any human body type. They moved around the perimeter of the house in the dark, and the family could hear them. Not footsteps exactly, but a presence, a weight in the air that pressed against the walls. And then they started touching the windows, long fingers tapping, a deliberate, patient rhythm against the glass. Not frantic, not aggressive, methodical, like something learning the boundary between outside and inside, testing whether the glass was the actual barrier or just a suggestion. And they talked to each other. That's the part that stays with you. Because when you hear two entities having a conversation outside your window at 2 a.m. in a language that doesn't belong to any human voice, distorted, layered, pitched at frequencies that feel wrong in your ears, your brain doesn't process it as language, processes it as threat. Your nervous system recognizes predator communication even when your conscious mind has no category for what you're hearing. The children couldn't sleep. Gwen stopped being able to function during the day. She lost her job. She couldn't concentrate, couldn't separate the daytime world from the nighttime horror, couldn't stop hearing those sounds every time the house went quiet. The kids' school lives collapsed. Teachers noticed. Counselors asked questions. The family gave answers that didn't come close to the truth because the truth wasn't sayable out loud. Sleep deprivation is a form of torture. What those stalkers at the glass were doing to that family was systematically dismantling them from the inside out. Night by night, window by window, in the dark, Terry was sitting on his porch in the pitch black of a Utah night with his rifle and his scope, scanning the horizon the way he'd done countless times. He'd gotten into the habit of using the scope as a surveillance tool. The magnification let him watch far corners of the property without crossing open ground. He found the orb by accident. It started as a glow at the edge of the field. Orange, warm-toned. He swung the scope toward it. It was expanding, slowly, taking on shape. A perfect oval of light hovering about 4 feet off the ground, growing until it was roughly the size of a door. And through the scope, he looked inside it. Blue sky, daylight, bright, clear, noon sky blue, visible through an oval tear in the middle of a pitch-black night. He described it the same way every time he told the story, like looking through a window in a wall, the night on his side, full daylight on the other, not a reflection, not an illusion, an actual physical aperture to somewhere else, a place where the sun was up, where the light was white and sharp and real. There is a specific kind of terror reserved for moments when physics breaks in front of your eyes. Not a monster, not a sound, just a door that shouldn't exist, hanging in the dark, showing you a sky that isn't your sky. The human brain is not designed to absorb that, cannot file it, cannot contextualize it. It just keeps replaying the image on a loop, daylight inside midnight, and the rational mind keeps reaching for an explanation that never comes. Terry lowered the scope. He sat on that porch for a long time, and he didn't tell anyone about it immediately, because some things you have to carry alone for a while before you can even find words for them. He went back the next night. Some part of Terry's brain, the stubborn, physical, working man part, needed to see it again, needed to confirm, needed to stand in front of the impossible and look at it one more time before accepting that this was real life. The portal was there. Same orange glow. Same expanding oval. Same impossible blue daylight inside the midnight frame. He watched it for a while, and this time he watched long enough to see what happened next. Something was moving inside the blue. A shape, dark, humanoid, moving with purpose toward the edge of the aperture, toward the threshold between whatever that place was and the dusty Utah night where Terry was standing. And then it emerged. It didn't step through like a person steps through a doorway. Crawled. Folded itself out of the vertical tear in reality with a movement that was wrong, wrong angle, wrong body proportion, wrong physics. Like watching a clip played at incorrect speed. It reminded Terry of footage he'd seen of something unnatural emerging from somewhere it shouldn't be. It hit the ground on all fours. Then it ran. In human speed, straight for the tree line, disappearing before he could raise his rifle. He stood there alone in the dark with an empty field in front of him and the portal shrinking back to a glow behind him. And the understanding hit him like cold water. The things outside his windows at night, the tall, featureless humanoids tapping on the glass, they weren't coming from the desert. They were coming through. There was a door on his property, and something on the other side knew it was open. There's a difference between being afraid of something and having fear injected into you against your will. The first one is a choice your brain makes. The second one is a violation. The blue orbs showed up sometime in the middle of the Sherman years. Drifting, floating, vibrant blue spheres moving slow and purposeful across the property. No sound, no heat, no visible mechanism of propulsion. Just light, drifting through the dark desert air like it owned the place. And when they got close, people felt it. Not a normal fear response. Not the adrenaline spike of seeing a snake or hearing a loud noise. This was something else entirely. An immediate, overwhelming flood of absolute panic and crushing anxiety that hit the body like a physical force. Heart rate spiking, chest constricting. The specific cognitive horror of feeling like something catastrophic is about to happen with zero external evidence to explain why. It was artificial, induced, beamed directly into the nervous system by proximity to the orb. Think about what that means from a psychological and scientific standpoint. If this is real and multiple witnesses described identical experiences with no coaching, then we're looking at something that can broadcast emotional states into human beings, that can reach into your nervous system and play it like an instrument. There is no defense against that. You can't shoot it. You can't outrun it. You can't logic your way out of a panic response your own body is generating. The light just drifts near you and your mind becomes a crime scene. This is what separated Skinwalker Ranch from every other haunting story. The entities there weren't just frightening. They were technically sophisticated. And whatever they were doing to those people, it was intentional. Terry had 3 dogs. Big ones. Trained guard dogs, the kind that don't back down from threats, that were bred and raised for exactly the kind of physical confrontation a working ranch sometimes demands. They'd proven themselves before. Terry trusted them. When the blue orb drifted into view one night, he made a decision. He opened the door and sent the dogs after it. They went immediately, full sprint, barking hard, charging the retreating light with everything they had. For a second, just a second, it felt like a win. The orb was pulling back. The dogs were chasing it toward the tree line. Terry stood on the porch and watched his animals do exactly what he'd raised them to do. They disappeared into the dark after the light. The barking continued, getting fainter with distance. Terry listened at the door, his dogs doing their job somewhere in the black woods. And then the barking changed. You know the sound a dog makes when it's hurt. There's a specific pitch to it, a yelp that's different from a bark in a way that hits you somewhere primitive. That's what came back from the dark. Not aggressive barking anymore. Yelping, pain sounds, sounds of animals in serious distress. And then silence. Terry locked the door. That's what he did. He locked the door and stayed inside and listened to the silence come in from the woods and fill up the house. He didn't go out until morning. And when he did, the dogs were gone. No blood trail, no drag marks, no signs of struggle, just gone. 3 living animals, swallowed by the same darkness that had taken his cattle. That was the night Terry Sherman decided to sell the ranch. In the morning, Terry and his son walked into the woods. They didn't have a plan. There was no investigation to conduct, no rational framework left to work within. They went because the dogs were gone and they were the dogs' people, and that meant something, even if everything else had stopped meaning anything they recognized. The forest was quiet. The light came through the branches the way it always does in early morning. Pale, thin, cutting sideways through the trees. They walked where the dogs had run the night before. They found the clearing, and in the clearing 3 small circles burned into the earth. Inside each circle, a tight, perfect pile of fine gray ash, not scorched ground from a large fire, not scattered remains from any known biological process. 3 contained circles, 3 neat piles, 1 for each dog. The ash fine enough that a breath of wind would scatter it. The circles precise enough that they looked measured. Whatever had taken those dogs hadn't eaten them, hadn't dragged them off. It had reduced them. 3 living animals, vaporized cleanly and deposited in 3 perfect circles as if to make a point. I can unmake things. I can take a living creature and leave you nothing but powder. There's a specific kind of grief for a person you couldn't protect. And there's a specific kind of grief for an animal, wordless, immediate, physical, when you find what's left of something that trusted you. That ash meant 3 lives. 3 animals who had done exactly what they were asked to do and had been destroyed for it. Terry walked back to the house. He called a real estate agent. He sold Skinwalker Ranch. He took whatever they offered. And he left. Most people who heard what Terry Sherman went through would have backed away slowly and never spoken of it again. Robert Bigelow heard it and wrote a check. Bigelow was already one of the more interesting figures in American aerospace. A real estate billionaire who had quietly redirected a significant chunk of his fortune into paranormal research. He was fascinated by the idea that consciousness and physical reality intersected in ways that mainstream science refused to examine. Skinwalker Ranch wasn't his first rodeo with this subject matter. But when the Sherman story crossed his desk, he recognized it as something different. This wasn't just eyewitness accounts and local legend. This was a specific geography with a consistent, documented pattern of activity spanning generations. This was a place where something appeared to be permanently operating, and Bigelow didn't want believers to go investigate it. He specifically wanted the opposite. He formed the National Institute for Discovery Science, NIDS, and recruited from the top tier of scientific credentials. PhDs, physicists, former law enforcement investigators, veterinary pathologists, people with no emotional investment in the paranormal, people who had spent their careers finding logical explanations for things that looked illogical. He wanted skeptics. He wanted the people most likely to debunk the story entirely. Because Bigelow had a theory. If something real was happening at Skinwalker Ranch, if the phenomena were genuine and reproducible, then the only way to establish that with any credibility was to put your hardest-nosed skeptics in the middle of it and let reality do the convincing. He was right. He just underestimated what reality out there was willing to do. The NIDS team showed up with the kind of equipment and attitude that should have made the ranch boring. Sensors everywhere, cameras on every angle, environmental monitoring for radiation, electromagnetic anomalies, chemical signatures, infrasound, trailers set up as mobile labs, a full toxicological sweep of the soil and water, psychological profiling of the neighboring families who had reported experiences over the years. Every rational explanation for every reported phenomenon, laid out in advance and systematically tested. For almost a full year, nothing happened. And I mean genuinely nothing. The team documented the environment with military thoroughness and found, in that first stretch, no readings that required an extraordinary explanation. The ranch sat quiet. The sky stayed dark and normal. The cattle stayed where they were supposed to be. The scientists began entertaining the idea that the Sherman family had experienced some kind of mass hysteria amplified by isolation and stress. And then, at the end of that quiet year, the NIDS team did something important. They wrote a formal report, a rigorous, methodologically sound scientific document. And in it, they formally concluded that the Shermans had not been hallucinating, that the experiences were real experiences, not imagined ones, that whatever had happened to that family deserved continued serious investigation. That conclusion changed everything, because now this wasn't about a scared family making wild claims anymore. Now you had credentialed scientists operating under strict protocols, formally stating on the record, something real happened here. And as if on cue, as if the entity had been watching, waiting for the right moment to test the new arrivals, things started happening again. The NIDS team had sensors all over that property. They had cameras. They had trained observers. They had everything you'd need to catch something in the act. And in broad daylight, with all of that equipment running, whatever lived on Skinwalker Ranch made its point anyway. Terry and Gwen were still on the property. Bigelow had kept them on as ranch managers, which meant they were living alongside the scientists. That day they were out in the field tagging newborn calves. Routine work, documented by the NIDS systems. No anomalies in the morning readings. An alert pulled them a few hundred yards away. Their dogs started growling toward the field. That growl, the specific one that means something is deeply wrong, not a stranger at the fence growl but a full-body biological alarm, brought them running back. The calf was there. Same calf they'd tagged less than 40 minutes earlier. Same ear tag they'd put on with their own hands. Now lying on the ground with that ear neatly removed. Surgically, bloodlessly, organs extracted from the body cavity with clean, precise incisions. No blood on the ground. No blood on the grass around it. The NIDS cameras captured the time gap. 40 minutes. Terry and Gwen had been within visual range for most of that window. Nothing had passed them. Nothing had entered or left the field through any of the monitored approaches. The veterinary pathologist who examined the calf used the same word every expert had used before: surgical. Performed by something with advanced anatomical knowledge, precision cutting capability, and the ability to remove an animal's blood content entirely before or during the process. In 40 minutes, in broad daylight, surrounded by scientific instruments, message received. The NIDS team's response to the midday slaughter was fast and coordinated. A forensic sweep of the property with all personnel deployed. They were looking for human intruders, boot prints, wire cutters, any sign of physical trespass that could explain the surgical calf mutilation as the work of some deranged person rather than an unexplainable entity. What they found instead, at 4 separate observation posts around the property, the guard dogs stationed there had each retreated to the back of their cages. Not lying down, not asleep, crouched, trembling, weeping. The sounds dogs make when their stress has hit a biological ceiling. All 4 of them at all 4 posts simultaneously, and every single dog was looking in the same direction, toward the same tree line. Terry stopped the vehicle before anyone else did. He'd developed a specific kind of instinct out here, a sensitivity to the ranch's rhythms that no instrument could replicate. He was already looking at the trees when he pointed. In the upper branches, maybe 25 feet off the ground, something was sitting up there. A wolf, except not a wolf. The size was wrong. The proportions were wrong. It was hunched on a branch with a mass and weight that the branch should not have been able to support. A huge, dark shape in the silhouette of a canine but bent into a perch the way no canine body is built to achieve. It was watching them. Every PhD on that team looked up at the same creature at the same moment. Cameras raised. Equipment running. The creature looked back. And not one person on the ground spoke. Because what do you say? What is the protocol? There isn't one. Nothing in any academic training prepares you for what to do when physics excuses itself and goes home. Terry opened fire. That part of the story is simple. He raised his rifle and shot the thing in the tree and kept shooting. The shots hit. You could hear them connecting. The creature didn't fall, didn't yelp, didn't drop from the branch. It absorbed the rounds the way the wolf on day one had absorbed them, without flinching, without registering pain, without doing anything that a physical body hit by high-caliber rounds should do. Eventually it leaped, not fell, leaped, down from the branch with a controlled motion, hit the ground, and disappeared into the thicket with a speed that prevented anyone from getting a clear angle for a follow-up shot. The NIDS team fanned out immediately. Scientists who had spent careers in controlled environments suddenly doing grid searches of a dark forest, following massive clawed prints pressed 2 inches deep into the soil, following protocol, taking measurements, photographing evidence. The tracks led them forward, deeper into the tree line, farther from the cameras, closer together as the stride shortened. And then the smell arrived, came first, before the track stopped. That chemical metallic rot that showed up every time something on this ranch ended or vanished. It filled the air of the forest with a presence so physical it felt like it had mass. The track stopped, same as always, same mid-stride termination in open ground with nowhere for anything to have gone. A group of PhD scientists stood in a Utah forest surrounded by the stench of something impossible and the silence of a creature that weighed 300 pounds and had just blinked out of existence. They stood there in silence, and every one of them had the same thought: we are not the researchers here. After the tree encounter, the mood at the ranch changed. The scientists didn't panic. They weren't the panicking type. But something shifted in the air that stayed shifted. A new understanding in the camp that the controlled, methodical, evidence-first framework they'd arrived with was operating inside a context that didn't care about their methodology. The guard dogs knew it first. After the tree encounter, the highly trained animals stationed around the property began refusing to leave their concrete kennels. Full stop. These were dogs bred for protection work. Animals with high thresholds for fear, conditioned to run toward threats rather than away from them. They cowered. They pressed against the back wall of their enclosures, and they would not come forward regardless of command or incentive. Think about what that communicates from an information standpoint. Animals operate on pure biological instinct stripped of any psychological overlay or denial mechanism. They cannot convince themselves to be brave in the presence of something their nervous system has identified as apex predator. They cannot rationalize the threat into manageable proportions. When a trained guard dog refuses to leave a concrete box, it is giving you the clearest possible reading of the local danger level. The scientists understood this. It was data, clean, unambiguous biological data. But there's a deeper psychological horror sitting inside this chapter for the humans involved. These researchers had come to Skinwalker Ranch carrying the implicit belief that knowledge equals safety. That if you could understand something, measure it, categorize it, you could manage your relationship with it. The ranch had been methodically teaching them, incident by incident, that they were wrong. Their instruments didn't protect them. Their credentials didn't matter. They'd been given a front-row seat to their own stalking, and the entity running the show had never once felt threatened by their equipment. The bulls were Terry's most valuable animals. 4 of them, big, healthy, worth serious money. And unlike the cattle that had been going missing in the snow or turning up surgically mutilated in the fields, these animals were housed in a secure enclosure with heavy gates and solid locks. They weren't wandering into the cursed tree line. They had no access to the forest. They were protected. Terry and Gwen checked them that morning. All four, calm and present in the corral. They noted the animals' behavior, confirmed the gate was secured, and drove to the far side of the property to handle a chore. A normal morning on a ranch that hadn't been normal in years. They came back maybe 40 minutes later. The gate was padlocked, exactly as they'd left it. No visible damage to the fencing. No broken posts. No signs of anything physically breached. The corral was empty. For massive animals, each weighing over 1,000 pounds. Gone from a locked enclosure without leaving a mark on the fence or the ground around it. Here's the thing about weight. 1,000-pound animal leaves evidence of its movement. It leaves ground impressions, gate stress, disturbed dirt. You cannot remove 4 of them from a locked space without leaving behind a physical record of how you did it. The laws of physics don't allow for it. The laws of physics on Skinwalker Ranch had stopped applying somewhere around the time those wolf tracks disappeared in the mud years before. But this time the NIDS cameras were running. This time there were logs and timestamps and witnesses. And the evidence said, the gate never opened. The fence never broke. And the bulls were simply no longer inside. Terry ran the perimeter first, checked the fence line, checked the gate again, walked the exterior of the property trying to find an exit point that the physics of the situation demanded must exist somewhere. He was crossing the yard when something caught his eye through a dirty window. A storage trailer. Small, old, rusted. It had been on the property for years, wired shut, not used, the kind of structure you stop seeing after a while because it's always just there. Ancient cobwebs on the door frame. Rusted baling wire twisted through the latch. The cobwebs were intact. The wire was undisturbed, and through the window he could see them. All 4 bulls, packed into a space that could not have held them if you'd planned it deliberately and spent hours trying. Their heads were bowed. Their bodies were pressed together in the impossibly small space with a stillness that was wrong. Not the stillness of tired animals, not the stillness of animals that had recently been herded somewhere stressful. A deep, biological blankness. A trance. Terry's voice broke the spell. The second they heard him, the bulls exploded out of whatever state they were in. Panicking in the cramped space, slamming into the walls, bellowing. The terror of suddenly awake animals in a space too small to move was almost worse than the silence that preceded it. The NIDS team documented the baling wire, the cobwebs, the door frame, everything undisturbed. There was no physical mechanism by which those 4 animals could have entered that trailer. Not through the door, not through the walls, not through the roof. They were inside, and then they woke up. The day after the bulls appeared in the trailer, the NIDS team walked the empty corral with instruments. Not because they expected to find anything conventional, but because at this point methodology was the only thing standing between them and complete cognitive collapse. What they found was anomalous in a way that was measurable, repeatable, and impossible to dismiss. The iron bars of the enclosure had become magnetized. Not slightly, strongly, unnaturally. The kind of magnetization that doesn't develop spontaneously in agricultural iron and requires a significant, directed electromagnetic event to produce. 2 researchers walked the perimeter with analog compass units, old-school, simple, reliable instruments that respond only to magnetic field variations. The needles went crazy, spinning away from true north and pointing toward a specific area outside the enclosure. Not randomly, not chaotically, but in unison, both compasses agreeing precisely on the direction of the anomaly. And then the smell arrived. That chemical metallic rot rolling in from wherever it always came from, the forest, the air, somewhere between places. and both men felt it simultaneously. The invisible, physical sensation of being watched. Not metaphorical, not psychological anxiety. A specific, embodied sensation of something's attention landing on your body like pressure. Both researchers described it identically in their separate reports, written hours apart, without comparing notes in between. This is what you don't get from ghost stories and folklore. You get it from scientists with instruments and training who are experiencing something their entire education has no category for, and who are being scrupulously honest about every detail of that experience anyway. That compass pointing into the stench while two PhDs felt eyes they couldn't see. That's not superstition. That's data. End of 1997. The NIDS investigation had been running for years by this point, and the team had accumulated enough anomalous data to fill filing cabinets, and still had nothing that constituted the kind of definitive, reproducible, hard science proof that changes paradigms. Two researchers were on the ridge above the homestead. Cold night, infrared goggles on, watching the property below through the green-tinged field of thermal imaging. Standard observation shift. The portal opened near the main house. They'd heard the descriptions. They'd read every account Terry Sherman had given. But seeing it firsthand through infrared, watching the orange glow bloom and expand into that impossible oval shape, hit differently than reading about it in a report. They held position, kept their equipment running, maintained protocol, and then the figure emerged. They watched through the goggles as a massive, featureless black humanoid crawled out of the aperture the same way Terry had described it. Wrong angles, wrong proportions, folding through the threshold with a movement that no human body achieves. It dropped to the ground. Then it looked up the mountain, directly at the ridge where the researchers were hidden. It ran. Not walked. Ran. Straight up the steep rocky mountainside, covering ground at a speed that matched nothing in the biological record. The crunch of shale getting louder and louder as two scientists held completely still and held their breath. The shadow came over the ridge and passed directly between them into the dark behind them. They sat there for a long time without moving. Neither one spoke immediately, because there's a difference between investigating something and having it charge your position. And that night, the investigation ran in the other direction. By 1998, the activity slowed. Not stopped, the ranch never fully went quiet, but the intensity dropped. The portals appeared less frequently. The humanoid entities pulled back. The surgical mutilations became sporadic. Whatever had been running its experiments on Skinwalker Ranch seemed, at least temporarily, satisfied. And the NIDS team was left standing in the desert with filing cabinets full of anomalous data and no framework sufficient to explain any of it. Bigelow eventually wound down the operation. The scientists returned to their respective institutions. Some of them published carefully worded academic papers. Some of them couldn't bring themselves to publish at all, aware of what it would do to their reputations. All of them carried what they'd experienced in a private place that didn't intersect with their professional lives in any comfortable way. Here's the piece that won't leave your head when you sit with this story long enough. Whatever was operating at Skinwalker Ranch in the 1990s chose that window deliberately. Pre-smartphone, pre-social media, pre-HD cameras in every pocket. A time when the most sophisticated documentation available still produced grainy footage and ambiguous readings. The NIDS team had military-grade equipment by the standards of the era. And it still wasn't enough. Not even close. The entity stayed consistently one step ahead of what the technology could capture, present enough to be real, elusive enough to be deniable. Almost as if something with sufficient intelligence had selected that exact technological moment to be most active. It let itself be felt. It refused to be proven. And when the era was about to shift, when the cameras would get better, when documentation would become harder to avoid, things went quiet. That's not coincidence. That's strategy. Skinwalker Ranch is still there. The desert hasn't moved. The 500 acres sit under the same Utah sky they always have. There have been other owners since Bigelow. Other investigations. Other scientists with better equipment who've returned to the property and found, depending on who you ask, either nothing or things that required confidentiality agreements to discuss. What we're left with 30-plus years after a family moved in and found their windows bolted and their doors double-locked is one of the most thoroughly documented and simultaneously least explained locations in the recorded history of paranormal phenomena. Not documented by believers, documented by people who went in looking to disprove and couldn't. That's the legacy. Not the portals, not the entities, not the surgical mutilations. The legacy is the inability to close the case. Because here's what's true. Either what happened at Skinwalker Ranch was a genuine, sustained encounter with something that operates outside our understanding of physics and biology, or it was the most elaborate, expensive, and convincing mass delusion ever visited upon a rotating cast of scientists, ranchers, and investigators spanning decades. Neither answer is comfortable. The psychological weight of what the Sherman family carried out of that property, what the NIDS scientists took back to their universities and their offices and their private lives, that doesn't evaporate. You don't unsee a creature in a tree-absorbing rifle fire. You don't unsee tracks that end in the middle of open mud. You don't unwatch a figure crawl out of a tear in the night sky. Whatever was out there had a system. It ran its experiment, collected what it came for, and when it was done, it pulled back. Not because it was defeated, but because it was finished. And somewhere out in that desert, in the space between the stars and the dirt, something is still waiting, patient, watching, deciding when it's time to come back.